I can pass the microphone slowly. Somebody I've known for years, we've worked together many years ago, and we're about to work together again. But I just stopped talking, and we just have a couple of minutes just to think.
Thank you very much. Nick, thank you very much. I was with Nick a couple of weeks ago at the Bishopsgate Methodist Church, where we had a similar event to this. And in this time, the time I've been doing this job specifically on Gaza since the 7th of October, we've taken at the JfP evidence from over 30 doctors. And there's one thing I just have to say, is can you just imagine the bravery of a human being to run into a war zone to put people back together again, like Nick and his colleagues have done. I just think we've had a moment of silence. Can we just have a round of applause for not just Nick, but the doctor? On my way here, somebody asked me, so I went to my other job before I came here, which is as a lawyer in a law firm called Finance. And somebody said to me, why are you doing this? And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, you like get 25,000 views on TikTok in your little presentations. And why are you going to a room to speak to 200 people or online? And it's a good question, because I had to drag my son with me today, and he's been with me all day to his detriment. And he has to listen to what I have to say all the way in the car, all the way while I'm here. And I just want to ask a question to you. How many people in this room saw the guest house after it had been bombed on BBC News or Sky News? How many people? And how many people, if you remember, BBC News and Sky and ITV reporting Al-Shifa Hospital when the Israelis took it over, and they showed videos of what they said were weapons all over the place. And we saw their allegation, this really amazing video graphic of the tunnels underneath it. You remember that, right? How many people remember seeing the hospital after it had been bombed? Anybody? Because you haven't seen that anywhere. And this is the sad part of the reason why people like Nick and people like me have to come to places like this, because you will not hear the truth on your TV screens. You just won't see it. And you won't see the truth on social media either, because even that's suppressed. And so you have to be in events like this where Nick can say things, like he said, in very clear terms, make assertions of fact, and not be sued for it, not be in trouble for it, because it's the truth. And this is really important for you all to understand. So I'll tell you why I'm here. I'm here to give you all the tools that you need to spread the message about what's going on, what our politicians are complicit in, and what's being hidden from you. And in order to do that, you've heard the evidence from Nick about what he's seen with his own eyes, evidence that corroborates at least 30 other doctors that I've interviewed for the purposes of my war crimes investigations. But what I want to do, slightly a bit tedious for you, I'm really sorry about that, but I'm going to try my best to speak as quickly as I can in the half an hour that I have, is to give you an overview of how we got here, where we are and where we're going. And I think that's really important. And remember, we're in election season. And what I want to think about is who you're going to vote for. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but I'd like you to work that out for yourself, because if you can't trust your politicians to tell you the truth about what's happening in Gaza when the evidence is so clear and obvious, how can you trust that same politician about your schools, about your NHS, about the economy, about the vulnerable in our society? Because they're not working in our interests. They're working in somebody else's interests. And that, again, is for you to work out, not for me to tell you, but it's so clear. It's so clear. I want to start by affirming that I am a lawyer, I'm a solicitor advocate, and I have a duty to uphold the constitutional principle of the rule of law and the administration of justice. And that means it's my duty as a lawyer to condemn the taking of life outside the rule of law. It doesn't matter if that life that's been taken is a Palestinian life, an Israeli life, Christian, a Muslim, or a Jew. But somewhat harder for some to understand is that includes the life of a belligerent, whether that life belongs to a Hamas member or an IDF soldier or any other party in a conflict. We have rules of war. Why do we have rules of war? It's because we as human beings consider life itself to be sacred, no matter who it belongs to. It should be an obvious human reaction to feel compelled to act to prevent harm when we see harrowing images of men, women, and children brutally killed or injured in any conflict or described in the way that Nick has. This applies equally to those that were killed in Israel and those that were killed in Palestine. Now, I start with these statements because it's incumbent on us to speak out against injustice, wherever it is and whoever the victims are. It's these principles that tell me that I would have worked to protect Jews and others from mass murder and genocide during World War II. I'm sure about that. I know that about myself because I'm doing it now. The October 7th attack in Israel was described by many as a surprise attack, a monumental failure of Israeli intelligence and security. But for many, the attack was not unexpected. It wasn't unexpected for me, it was anticipated. It came amid an ongoing failure to grapple with a dangerous situation for Palestinians in the West Bank, where Israel's government and its extreme far-right elements had escalated the brutal daily pain of occupation. Occupation. Let's not forget, when we describe this war or conflict, it's not a war or conflict, it's an occupation by Israel of Palestine and the Palestinian people. The cycle of violence in Palestine and Israel is perpetuated as a result of the enduring subjugation and occupation of Palestine by Israel. An equal application of law based on race and religion. And most importantly, the exceptionalism and impunity gifted to Israel by the international community for the most serious violations of international law. When I say international community, what do I mean? I mean by human beings, our politicians that make the rules, that give this immunity. It doesn't happen because the United Kingdom, a piece of land, decided to give exception. It's because men and women decided to give this exceptionalism to Israeli politicians to protect them from war crimes. The result of this collective political failure by the international community is the cause of the outburst of violence we saw on October 7th. I'm not justifying it, I'm explaining why it happened. Israel has not only been committed to carry out a systematic human rights violations for decades, but what's it done now? It's managing this conflict to render states complicit in its violations and all of us on the brink of a massive regional war. The very formation of Israel as a Jewish state has included the displacing and erasing of the indigenous Arab presence. Mass ethnic cleansing of Palestine non-Jewish populations occurred during the Nakba between 1947 and 1949 and have continued since then. Important words, I'll say it again, continued. It wasn't just the Nakba, it's never stopped, not to this day. Israel has engaged in killings, destruction of villages and towns, looting, the mass displacement of hundreds of thousands, and denial of the right to return of expelled Palestinians. Israel's policy and treatment of Palestinians can be described as a settler colonial project through military occupation and denying the Palestinian people the right to self-determination, a right Israelis claim for themselves and will fight for. Segregation and control of Palestinians have been achieved through land confiscation, house demolitions, revoked residencies, and deportation. And in order to maintain its subjugation of Palestinians, Israel has construed Palestinians as security threats to justify their oppression and decivilization of the area. Israel has progressively turned Gaza into a highly controlled enclave. Since the 2005 evacuation of Israeli settlers, Israeli leaders have framed Gaza as a territory to be recolonized and its population as invaders that should be expelled. These claims were affirmed by Netanyahu in December 2022 as an integral to the project of consolidating the exclusive and unassailable right of the Jewish people on the Greater Israel. The acts taken to fulfill these claims are unlawful in international law. And this is the part that I want you to understand. There are three primary international institutions designed to uphold international humanitarian law: the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and more recently, the International Criminal Court. The situation in Gaza, though, has demonstrated in visceral detail the international community's lack of commitment to any real international law-based order, particularly if supporting it would in some way be against their own perceived national interests. Around the globe, world leaders condemned the actions of Hamas in Gaza for October 7th. They have unequivocally championed the right of Israel to defend itself, sending a green light to Benjamin Netanyahu and his government that he was free to reduce Gaza into rubble. They sent a clear message that there will be no consequences and complete impunity for anything that Israel did. And you've seen what Israel's done. You've seen what they're doing. Right now, today, what Nick has described is happening to people, men, women, and children. Netanyahu has been quickly pledged more military and financial aid to help his promised act of revenge. He made it clear It wasn't retribution, and so it wasn't self-defense in the beginning. He wanted vengeance. And we, as a state, along with the United States and our allies, pledged money for that vengeance. Western leaders are guilty of viewing Palestine and Israel through a prejudiced prism of merciless Palestinian terrorists against the gentle Jewish victims that are desperately maintaining the only democracy in the Middle East. They refuse to see Israel as a state carrying out acts of apartheid and engage in a brutal and belligerent occupation of an indigenous group of people. They refuse to recognize that Israel's history of belligerent occupation of Palestine, mixed with impunity, would mean that Israel was likely to take action which would be wholly disproportionate to any threat it might actually face. The risk would have been clear to politicians in the UK. And I'll tell you why it would have been clear to politicians in the UK. Because in 2009, I led a legal team for an application in a British court before a British judge under British law for an arrest warrant for former Israeli Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni, who had part in alleged war crimes, killing civilians during Operation Cast Lead in Gaza in 2009. We were successful in that application. A British court granted us that arrest warrant. So it was clear to a British court what Israel was capable of doing 14 years ago. By October 2009, sorry, by October the 9th, 2024, Israel had made clear to the rest of the world what it was prepared to do now, that it had suffered 1,200 casualties on its own soil. It had threatened a response which promised disproportionate and unlawful violence against the whole population of Gaza under the controversial pretext of self-defense. And you've heard self-defense being raised by Keir Starmer, by Rishi Sunak, and almost every politician. Let's talk about self-defense. The right asserted by Israel is a right under Article 51 of the UN Charter, but it's considered as inappropriate for an occupation. The Article 51 right to self-defense is state against state self-defense. It's not state against occupied people self-defense. This is a really important thing to put back on when people say Israel is acting under self-defense. Article 51 is specifically provided to allow states to repel attacks, and even that right is only temporary until the Security Council takes action. And that any concept of self-defense must be reasonable and proportionate and cease once the immediate attack has stopped. We're way, way beyond any notion of self-defense, however Israel or British political allies want to frame it. Self-defense is not permission to punish or a license for vengeance. In any event, Israel was being encouraged by politicians across the globe to take whatever action it wanted in order to defend itself against Hamas, despite its track record for disproportionate attacks against Palestinians. In 2009, Operation Cast Lead saw the killing of 1,400 Palestinians, including 300 children, with over 5,000 injured. And you know what? We thought that was really bad. We thought that was really bad. In 2014, Israel killed 2,189 Palestinians, including 513 children, with over 11,000 injured. And we thought that was really bad in 2014. In 2023 and 2024, Israel has so far killed over 36,000 people, mostly women and children. You know, I knew what Israel was going to do. I spoke about it at the Labour Party conference in a speech on October the 9th. I estimated around 200,000 deaths at a minimum. And now since October the 7th, and after 6 months of military operations, Israel has absolutely destroyed Gaza. As I said, 36,000 Palestinians have been killed, including more than 14,000 children. 12,000 are presumed dead and 71,000 injured with many life-changing injuries. More children have been killed, as Nick said, in Israel's attack on Gaza since October the 7th and in all wars since the year 2000 combined. I mean, just think about that statistic. And we still pretend, our government still pretends that it's not that bad. Israel has injured hundreds of thousands and displaced over 1.5 million people. Israel has destroyed and severely damaged most of the life-sustaining infrastructure in Gaza. They have destroyed 77% of healthcare facilities, 68% of telecommunications infrastructure, large numbers of municipal services, commercial and industrial sites, almost half of all the roads, over 60% of Gaza's 439,000 homes, 68% of residential buildings, all universities, 60% of other educational facilities, including 30 libraries. Israel destroyed at least 195 heritage sites, 208 mosques, 3 churches, and Gaza's central archives, immediately wiping out 150 years of history. I don't expect you to remember the statistics. But I do want you to think about the statistics in the context of the conflicts, because you won't have heard them anywhere else. But it's happening in Gaza. And the most important thing, I'll come back to it, you won't have heard it on the BBC, on Sky News, on Channel 4. You won't have heard it in any of those places. But you know it now. You know it now. Israel has destroyed the health infrastructure, in my view, absolutely, absolutely. It has starved the population of Gaza to the level of famine. People are literally dying of starvation at the behest of Israeli government policy and military strategy. I mean, just think about that. It's an actual strategy that we will starve people to death. To death. And they don't even pretend. Israel doesn't even pretend, because what it says to Hamas is, we will stop starving your people not when you surrender your hostages, when you give up, when you lay down your arms and when you give up. I'll tell you something, that's not true. Hamas could surrender 100 times over, and this will not stop. That's not true. And we also know, in the recent United States sort of weird gambit of pretending that Israel had put forward a peace settlement, which Israel rejected, that Hamas said, yeah, okay, sounds good. And Israel rejected it. Israel has no interest in a peace settlement at the moment. Now, I just want to talk very briefly. I don't want to give you a long law lecture. I really don't. That's a different lecture for law students. You may get time, right? But I want to talk about the ICJ and the ICC. The step that has been taken by South Africa at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is historic. It was a dangerous step for the politicians. I've been in South Africa. I was in South Africa last month, and I met the politicians and the legal teams behind this. And they're under threat. They took a huge step. They're under risk. It wasn't completely celebrated. They're worried for their lives because of the step they took. It was amazing. A global South country triggering its obligations under the Genocide Convention. And it's an amazing thing. You know what? We didn't do it in the United Kingdom. With all our values and all our rhetoric and all our support for international law, we didn't do it. The Genocide Convention is really important, because not only does it act to punish genocide, it acts to prevent genocide. And let's just look at that for a moment. That means that the British government could have triggered the Genocide Convention in order to try to prevent it, and it didn't. And neither did the United States, and neither did any European country, and neither did any so-called civilized, developed Western country, but South Africa, with all its problems, did. And that's a significant thing. That's a very significant thing. I want to take a moment to explain to you what genocide is. Any of the specified acts committed, I'm reading the definition because it's the quickest way to do it without boring you. Any of the specified acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. According to the crime of genocide, comprises two interconnected elements: the act and the intention. The specified acts defined in relation to protected groups as killing of members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. The Israelis destroyed the only IVF clinic in the whole of Gaza, and also forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now just think about what I just said and think about what Nick told you. And you tell me if that fits into that definition, because I'll tell you it does. My legal analysis of that is that it does. The other part of the genocide act is the intention. So you've got the actions, and you've got to show that Israel intended on those things as being an attack on a part of the group or the whole group. Well, Israel is so used to impunity that it admits to it. I'm just going to give you one quote from Benjamin Netanyahu. He invoked Amalek, biblical scripture. Right? Kill every man, woman, and child, infant, and calf and ox, and so on. You're probably more familiar with that than I am. That is a genocidal speech. That's genocidal speech. And not only was it said by Benjamin Netanyahu, head of state, it goes all the way down to soldiers are saying it on the ground before they go into Gaza and attack Palestinian civilians. And as a result of the South Africa's triggering of the Genocide Convention, the ICJ found a plausible risk of irreparable prejudice to the rights of Palestinians in Gaza, a protected group under the Genocide Convention, and ordered Israel to take all measures within its power to prevent genocidal acts, prevent and punish incitement to genocide, and ensure urgent humanitarian aid. What does that mean? That means, because there's been lots of debate on our TV, we've had the ex-president of the ICJ come out and say, well, we did actually find that there was a risk of genocide. It means that what Israel was doing on the ground in Gaza presented a risk to Palestinians of genocide. Full stop. Don't let anybody else tell you anything different. That's what the ICJ has found. Because if they didn't find that, they wouldn't have ordered what's called provisional measures to make Israel stop that risk happening to Palestinians on the ground. That's really important, number one. Number two, the next thing that's happened most recently, after months and months of lobbying, months and months of pressure on Karim Khan to do the right thing as the prosecutor of the ICC, he finally lived up to his mandate and applied for arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant for very serious war crimes. The crime of starvation is included in that. The reason why I mentioned the crime of starvation is because I'm going to come back to that as work that we've done in the ICJP, where we've also lodged a complaint to Scotland Yard with regards to the crime of starvation. Now, South Africa's application to the ICJ was a monumental moment in history, as was Karim Khan's application for arrest warrants. It was a global South country risking its own standing and liberty for an oppressed nation, having recently removed the shackles of its own apartheid and oppression. It knows what that means. The current proceedings of the ICJ and ICC demonstrate something. They demonstrate an inherent weakness in the structural protections we have when rights in international humanitarian law are violated. It just doesn't work for us. It doesn't work. There is little personal cost to perpetrators for violating international law. On the contrary, what I found in my 20 plus years of working in international humanitarian law is that the risk-benefit calculation is heavily weighted in the favor of committing war crimes for financial, political, and personal gain. It's woeful that maybe 80 years after the end of World War II, which saw a death toll of around, and when I say death toll, people usually think I'm going to talk about 6 million people that died in the Holocaust. I have a different figure to present to you. That is heinous. 6 million people dying in the Holocaust is heinous. I remember learning about this in school. Death toll of 75 million human beings that we killed from our own race because of World War II. 75, that's a phenomenal, mind-blowing number. And even despite that number of deaths, we have not learned our lesson. We allow genocide to repeat itself. And our governments, Western governments who created the international rules-based system, are protecting people perpetrating genocide. We don't have an independent, objectively operating instruments to put in place. We don't have them. We don't have these objective instruments that we can put in place in any practical way to protect people when their rights have been violated, even when the allegation is genocide. The UN Security Council has failed immeasurably to halt any acts that might plausibly present violations of international law. Veto after veto left the UN almost meaningless until the 25th of March. The UN Security Council voted for an immediate ceasefire and the release of all hostages. With the Security Council's power of veto is clear demonstration that the most powerful states are not prepared to work democratically, ceding their power to collectively to states, but will remain determined to put the national state interests before the interests of the international community. In any event, neither the Israelis nor Hamas have complied with the UN resolution, and the result is that we are teetering on the brink of a full war in the region and the continued deterioration of the plight of the Palestinians. But you know what? It's not. I do not trust the United Nations. I do not trust the ICC, and I do not trust the International Court of Justice. For me, I also blame myself for where we are, because it's lawyers like me that have made a fundamental mistake in the past. When we have investigated war crimes, we've only attacked the suspects of war crimes in the theatre of warfare. So what that means is we attack, for example, the soldier on the ground, the commander that gave him or her orders, and the politician that made the decision to go to war. And we left it at that. And when we failed to bring those people to justice, we thought, okay, fair enough, we tried. It was a mistake. It was a really big mistake. Because behind that theatre of war is a massive international interest-based war machine. Here in the UK, in the United States, and as I said in the opening of my presentation to you, this is not a country, a geographical land. These are human beings making a decision. These are the same kinds of people that have been killed on the screen that you saw. They have families, they have wives, they have husbands, they have children, they have mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, but they also appear to have impunity because we forgot about them. We forgot that they were potentially the absolute cause of what we're seeing happening on the ground in Gaza. And these politicians that supported the perpetration of war crimes by either providing political cover, encouraging it, or supplying weapons or military material to war criminals have not been the subject of our legal proceedings. Complicity is defined in their own statute, Article 25, as aiding, abetting, and in any other way supporting the commission of a crime. And in the UK, the International Criminal Court Act allows for secondary liability, including the offence of conspiracy, which means that politicians could be liable for war crimes. Yet the UK and the US, along with others, continue to support and supply weapons and finance to Israel, rendering the decision makers personally liable to the accusation of complicity in genocide and other war crimes. My experience with the Zippy arrest warrant led me to understand that the state, no matter what its rhetoric, could not be relied on or trusted to uphold the rule of law, international law. It's for this reason that we created the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians. We try to present pathways to peace and alternatives to violence by pursuing accountability through the courts. At the ICJP, we work with the infrastructure behind the war and behind the killing in order to try to prevent it. And often because we can't prevent it, and we don't stop, we're not an army, and we don't have the resources of government, and so we often can't prevent it. So then what we try to do is we try to hold those that are guilty of war crimes accountable for their part in it. And this time we intend to do it with British politicians using British law, even when they're out of office. We intend to make the cost of this war personal to them until they're held accountable. In 2009, as I mentioned, I was a lead lawyer, successfully obtained the arrest warrant for Zippy Livni. Now, based on clear evidence, the court agreed there was a prosecutable case. That meant that Zippy Livni would have been arrested and taken straight to prosecution in the court. No in-between investigation was required, which gives an indication of the strength of the evidence. But you know what? The reason we failed was not because of our lack of evidence, and it wasn't because the court was corrupt or interfered with. It was because we had corrupt politicians that worked tirelessly to create a system of law to protect war criminals, including Zippy Livni and others, from prosecution in the United Kingdom. And they did that by making sure that if we applied for an arrest warrant successfully again, the Attorney General, a politician, not a judge, would have to give his consent or her consent for prosecution, which means they could protect war criminals in this country from our courts, from our own courts. It's phenomenal. But we've decided something. We've realized that protecting war criminals in this way is a war crime. And so now we can refer the Attorney General, along with the Attorney General's allies or co-conspirators, as I like to call them, and to the ICC for prosecution. And we've seen the ICC take a big step, and so this is what we intend to do. We've already referred 5 British ministers to Scotland Yard using extraordinarily strong evidence for war crimes, including collective punishment, as well as the crime of starvation. And my analysis of the Scotland Yard response is that they're taking it seriously, in the same way as the police, the Crown Prosecution Service, and the courts took Zippy Livni's evidence seriously. So I'm wanting these politicians that we've accused of war crimes, not in Parliament, but in prison. That's the idea behind that. But just think about one thing. Had politicians not interfered with our arrest warrant process, think about what would have happened. The strength and deterrent impact of international law may have even prevented what we're seeing now, not only in Gaza, but also in the Ukraine, because international law would have meant something. So look, I don't want to take a lot of time because I think it's really important to have some questions and answers. But what I want to just go and talk to you a little bit about is a little bit of my own personal experience when I went to. So part of what we've been doing at the ICJP is collecting evidence, and we have a pipeline of around 1,800 individuals that whose evidence we want to gather, and we're at the beginning of that stage. But what that's meant is that we've had to travel at the ICJP to many foreign jurisdictions. So far, we've travelled to around at least 26, 30 different states, meeting heads of state, meeting ministers of justice, meeting foreign ministers, to give them the message that we need to break the shield of impunity that Israel has. And the only way we're going to ever find a solution is to apply equal law to Palestinians and Israelis for violations of law in that jurisdiction. But I just want to explain to you. So I want to share a story with you, and it's not as powerful as Nick's, but it hopefully makes you understand why the work that we're doing is really important. And I went to a refugee camp, and I can't tell you where this refugee camp was. The refugee camp was a post-October the 7th refugee camp where children and some adults have been taken to be treated for very serious injuries outside of Palestine and Israel. And I spent some time at the camp assessing the evidence, soft screens that we could produce from these places, where these people have been brought for treatment. And I just want to share my personal reflection about that. And the truth is, I'll tell you what, I had to turn my Apple Watch off during Nick's speech because my heart rate monitor kept going off. And I was thinking, well, at least I've got a doctor in the house. So, I had to say that because it was a bit distracting because this does affect you personally, and it really does. And I want it to affect all of you because that's the best way that you become advocates. And when I was in this camp, I never felt so much anger and sadness at the world for what I saw it allowed to happen and continue to happen in Gaza. I met children in this camp that looked so hollow that I didn't have anything to. I went there, really big and bold, and I'm going to get all this evidence. But when I met them, I couldn't look them in the face, let alone speak to them. I really couldn't. I was ashamed of myself for being British, for being part of a state that caused them to be where they were. And I'll say that again, for being part of a state that caused them to be where they were, because we did. We're part of this. I saw kids, as Nick has described, with multiple amputated limbs. And when you see it, right, it's different to hearing about it or seeing a picture. When you see it, when you see a kid sitting in a wheelchair with 2 legs missing and an arm missing, it's different to hearing about it. And I saw these kids, but I saw this girl, and I'm really sorry for her. She was younger. I have a daughter as well. I have a 13-year-old daughter. I saw a girl, and she had scars all the way across her face, And what was really sort of moving for me was that she was asking one of the carers to brush her hair and put Mickey Mouse clips in her hair, because being pretty was still important to this child. Just think about that for a minute, right? It's the normal thing. A lot of people in this room have got daughters. She's just like one of them. Just like one of them. We sat on beanbags on like an AstroTurf football pitch, which wasn't being used for football, it was just an area. And so we sat on beanbags while I was talking to various people. And I saw this little girl come along and sit on a beanbag. She was probably about 5 years old, 4 or 5 years old. And then she bounced off that beanbag into another beanbag, slowly getting closer and closer. I watched her. And then she came, and then she sat with her back to my side, just next to me like this. And I turned to her and I said, hi, do you speak English? No, I don't speak English, right? Just shy. And I asked about her. She was an orphan. She lost her parents. And it's clear she wanted to sit next to this weirdo from England that comes to speak to people because she wanted that bond. She wanted that. It's absolutely heartbreaking. I saw adults that had lost everything and they had guilt. And I'm sure Nick understands this. And the Palestinian people in the room, they had guilt for not being there, having been brought into safety. There was one guy that was asking me if I could help smuggle him back in because he'd been brought out unconscious and his wife and child were still inside Gaza. I didn't meet these 2 people, but I heard about a 2-year-old with an amputated leg who still wanted to run races, and a child who lost 60 members of a family, and as Nick described, was a child left without family, which is the acronym that he talked about. Seeing these injuries, I've nearly finished, I'm sorry, but there's just one last bit that I want to share with you. So amongst these children, right, I met smart, and I haven't told my son this story, and I do want him to hear it. So I think it's important because we try to protect young children from this. But amongst the kids, I met this smart, good-looking, intelligent 15-year-old boy who told me, he came to me, he came hobbling over on his crutches, and he said to me, I want to be a human rights, I wanted to be a human rights lawyer. And he had serious injuries to his legs. I asked him to sit with me, and it took him a good minute to be able to bend onto the beanbag and sit down with help. And he was in pain. And then once the pain subsided, he told me a story. He said, well, my dad is a doctor, actually, and you might know him. And he's still in Gaza, working in a hospital. He said, I worry about him every day because the only time I can speak to him is when he gets to the top of the roof of the hospital and he can send me out a text message. I don't know when it's going to be. So every day I worry that he's going to be killed. He said to me that he was in a hospital when it was attacked by Israeli soldiers. He said that he had seen a person's head being crushed under the rubble. And he described it in this way. He said he saw the head change to a square shape until it gave way under the weight of the rubble. He told me that when he was in Gaza, he volunteered for human rights NGOs. But now, looking me straight in the face, he said, I don't believe in law and human rights anymore. He told me these were things for everyone else and not for Palestinians. He told me he felt abandoned by the world. At first, I didn't know what to say to him. I really didn't. I was sitting again, I thought I was embarrassed. And then I realized how strong this 15-year-old still was. You see, he was determined to make me, a foreigner to him, understand what was happening in Gaza. And honestly, he did a better job than anyone else I've met. He kept saying to me, you will never know what it's like because I lived it and you haven't. He thanked me for the work I was doing, but thought it would not make any difference whatsoever. He told me he had no hope at all. I told him after a few minutes that I saw hope. And when he asked me where, I pointed at his chest and I told him, you are the hope. You see, this was an amazing, resilient, brilliant Palestinian child who absolutely encapsulated the amazing Palestinian spirit that I've seen and Nick's described. Now, I'm determined for this boy to tell his story, and I'm going to make him an ambassador for the JfP. I want him to become a human rights lawyer. I don't want that to be taken away from him too. So I want to thank you all for being here today and listening to us, to myself, Nick and Mike. And the final message I have for you is that we must work as a collective against tyranny. And we must hold those that violate the law accountable before it. We must come together to make this change to support and protect the institutions that we created to fulfill the most fundamental duty one human being can have to another, to protect life. Thank you.